Oh hey, it's Wes. And Maggie. And today, it's time to talk about the new Venus Laowa 58mm f2.8 CA Dreamer Macro 2X. From here on out, it will be called the Laowa Macro. Recently, we also talked about the new 90mm Laowa macro lens, and we found that it was very sharp, very creamy, a very nice lens. Now, one part of the name that's not on the side of the lens here is the APO that they put after it. That's apochromatic. That means we shouldn't see any chromatic aberration in this. Will we? Well, we'll get into that in the review, starting with the categories, as always, with the build quality. No surprises here, this is very similar to the 90mm lens from Laowa, in that it's an all-metal design. We have an enormous amount of focusing ring here, teeny tiny bit of aperture ring. We have a fairly standard lens cap. It's a little bit thick. It's plastic. We have a plastic pedal-shaped lens hood. Now, one issue that I have with that is that the lens cap is just a little bit on the large side, and sometimes when you're taking the hood off, it also takes the cap off. So this is nothing special. It's not a locking lens hood, but then again, most aren't. This is not a weather-sealed lens. If we come around to the back here, we see we just have some metal. We don't have any electronic contacts with the lens. I asked Laowa about that, and they said it's just kind of not their thing. They're leaving that to other companies. At this point, it feels like a little bit of a cop-out, and I'm going to be talking about that more with a lot of other manual focus lenses that we have coming up here. I feel like with the economies of scale, we could be putting in those contacts from here on out to have the automatic manual focus assists that are built into these mirrorless cameras. So as soon as you start focusing, you can choose whether or not to have it automatically punch in on the focus point, which is super convenient, and it also gives you metadata on the lens in your pictures, which would also be very convenient because I'm currently testing 5 manual focus lenses right now, and that gets super confusing in my catalog because none of them tag the metadata. And let's say you have a big collection of Laowa lenses, all of a sudden it's hard to keep track of what photos are taken with what lenses. So I really want to see that going forward. Moving on, this is a very solid lens, obviously. We're just lacking weather sealing and some touches here and there. It's an 8 out of 10 for build quality. Moving on to handling and usability. This lens is quite large for 58mm. This is almost twice the size of Sony's 50mm macro lens, but that one has external focusing. This one, as you can see, is all internal focusing. It has an enormous amount of play, which is perfectly normal for a macro lens. That's why a lot of autofocus macro lenses are a bit painful, because that focus element has to move so far. The focus ring, as I said before, is gigantic. It's a little bit slippery. I kind of wish that they didn't have it extending all the way down to here, just so that we'd have more of the lens to grab a hold of. We got the front, that's a decent amount of space. In the back here, there's a teeny tiny separation, and then we have the aperture ring in the back. Let's listen to it. It is a permanently clicked aperture ring, which is good. I'm not going to be doing a lot of video with this, although it would be nice to have click-declick. But overall, it's nice to have it in the back. There is a lot of slipperiness to the aperture ring here. It's a little bit hard to grip. That's a bit of a nitpick though. Focus peaking works phenomenally well with this because this lens is incredibly sharp. The sharper the lens is, the better focus peaking works. The more you get those little tiny edges, and you can turn focus peaking down to the lowest level, which is the most accurate level. One issue that I've had with this lens is that when applying sensor-based image stabilization, you have to choose your focal length. There's a 58mm lens. That's not one of the focal lengths you can choose from, but that's not the big problem. The big problem is there is an enormous amount of focus breathing going on with this lens. Like, the field of view changes so much on this that sensor-based image stabilization is almost completely useless. Although this is 58mm, it is almost never actually a 58mm field of view because that focus breathing is just off the handle, which kind of surprises me because this isn't exactly a small lens, but the actual lens elements, if I go all the way back on this to infinity focus, you can see that the aperture inside this lens is all the way back here. There is very little room left in here. And as such, focus breathing is not well compensated. It's not compensated at all in this lens. And that's not an enormous issue because it does zoom in further the closer you get. And again, you're not going to be doing a lot of like video focus transitions with this. If you plan on doing video work though, this might not be the lens for you. Now, one usability issue we have with this that we didn't have with the 90mm is that when you're doing 2x macro shots, like you're right down to the minimum focus distance on this, because this is 58mm, you have to get so close that you're basically touching the object with the front of the lens. You got to take off that lens hood. At this focal length, 2x macro is not super practical. Now, if you can get your lighting right and you're like right in there with some special, you know, the macro ring thing, sure, that might work out. But with regular lighting and stuff, you're going to be casting a shadow on your subject. So kind of mixed bag when it comes to 2x at a focal length like this. Most of the time, you're so close that you're knocking nose with the B. But overall, it is a very easy lens to use, just a little bit on the large side. So I'm going to give that an 8 out of 10. Image quality. And here's where we expect some good stuff. And do we get good stuff? Yes, we do. If you want to see more image samples, check down the link in the description. There'll be lots there on my website. This lens is super sharp. Wide open around the edges, still not quite perfect. And that was kind of an element of the 90mm macro lens from Laowa. But as soon as you stop it down a little bit, this thing is razor sharp across the board. If you try to take portraits with it, I don't recommend it. It is too sharp. It will bring out way too much. Is it sharper than the Sony 90mm macro? At 2.8, it definitely is. And a lot of other apertures, I suspect that it might be as well. Sony, I expect to release a GM version of their macro lens pretty soon because third-party manufacturers are easily besting them at this point. There was a time that the Sony 90mm macro was the sharpest lens in town, but it just isn't anymore. The bar has been raised incredibly high. When it comes to chromatic aberration, incredibly well controlled. It is quite flare resistant, not perfectly so, not like a G Master lens, but still very good. Colors are fantastic. Rendition is lovely. It is a solid lens. So I'm going to give that a 9 out of 10 for image quality. Image character. This is where the Sony 90mm macro has some issues. Now, when it first came out, I gave it a decently high rating on that because at certain macro apertures, and by that I mean from like f4 to f6, you have a pretty decent quality, but wide open, very busy and nervous. Stop down also gets very busy and nervous. This lens, wide open, super creamy. Medium apertures, we're talking like 4 to 6, also very creamy and nice. But you stop it down further than that, you start to see the aperture blades, you start seeing some hexagons in the bokeh. It still stays quite smooth, but from like 2.8 to f6, f7.1, this has clearly smoother bokeh than the Sony 90mm macro. I would say it's not quite as smooth as the 90mm from Laowa when it stopped down, but honestly, overall, I still like the rendition of this lens better than the 90mm from Laowa. And obviously better than the Sony. Not sure what it is, if it's just because we're getting a tighter field of view or what, but I just like how this renders. It has a very nice fall off, a little bit of pop. It's not interesting in any way. You're not going to get flare, your fun effects and stuff like that, but it is very smooth, very neutral. Looks fantastic. I have to give this an 8 out of 10. It is my favorite macro lens with regards to rendition and look to date. Autofocus. This lens, you might be cross-shopping between this and the 50mm from Sony, which has autofocus, or the 90mm from Sony, which has autofocus, so I have to give this a rating here. But if you're cross-shopping to manual focus, I have 2 ratings at the end that includes it or doesn't include it. It's a 0 out of 10. I would actually give it a few more points if it had contacts and a chip that allowed you to do automatic focus assist, but it doesn't have that. Peaking works great though, because of how sharp this lens is, but it's a 0 out of 10 for autofocus. Value. This one is a little bit tough because, yeah, it's a manual focus lens, but it is a very high quality lens. And so we're looking at $500. How does that stack up to everything else? Well, Laowa actually has an older version of this, much like when they came out with the 90mm macro, they already had a 100mm macro, so this is an update. The old one was $400, this one is a better lens. You can get this lens right here, the Astrahori 85mm macro. It's also a tilt lens, which is fun. We'll be talking about that soon. And this lens is $330, significantly less. Is it as sharp as the Laowa? No, it is not. But it is a manual focus macro lens that can give you very respectable results. Aside from that though, if we move up the scale just a little bit here, you've got the Sony 50mm macro at $550, nowhere near the image quality of the Laowa lens. Let's get that out of the way right now. But you could also get the Voigtlander 65 for $1,000, which is a very high quality lens, twice as much money though, so you should hope so. And then you also have the other Laowa, the new 90mm macro Dreamer lens for $500 as well, so just pick your focal length there. Got the Sigma 70mm 2.8 for $570. We have similar optical quality there. The Sigma is a very sharp lens, but it does cost more, but you get autofocus. And then there is the Sony 90mm macro up on my camera here for $1,100. It's a lot more. So, this is tough. It's a little more expensive than the cheapest options, but it is clearly better than the cheapest options. So I'm going to have to give this a 9.5 out of 10. I think that at $500, this is just a bargain because it's giving you better image quality than the $1,100 lens from Sony. And honestly, the autofocus in the Sony 90mm macro is kind of miserable. On the A1 or A9, it is absolutely usable. But on past cameras, like say the A7 III, A7 II, a lot of the A7R cameras, the autofocus is completely unusable. But on like an A9 or A1, yeah, the autofocus works great, but you're still not getting the same hit rate of like one of their more modern lenses with direct drive autofocus. So yes, it has autofocus, but no, it's not phenomenal for focusing. Here we have the Laowa macro, fantastic value, great bang for your buck. If you want just the crispiest of macro images, you can trust these lenses to get them for you. Just have to manually focus it, which most people do for macro photography anyway. So what does that give us for a total score? That gives us a 42.5 out of 50, or 85% on the manual scale. But on the absolute scale, we're looking at 70.8%. Let's see how that stacks up in the West Scores spreadsheet. At a tie with the 90mm. It does a little bit better on the image character, a little bit worse on the value. And honestly, when I reviewed the Laowa 90mm, the Astrahori lens wasn't out yet. Maybe it would have come out differently there. But it's a tie, which is not shocking at all because those lenses are so very similar. They're just different focal lengths. If you want to pick up one of these lenses, there are links in the description down below to help support this channel. And all right, he already went to bed. Feed my fat cats. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns about this lens, let me know in the comments below and I will get back to you. But until next time, I'll put this slightly annoying lens hood on and go take some photos.